Welcome to the Stuff You Should Think About podcast, where I answer everyday questions about phenomena and objects. I'm G. How's it going? So, today I want to talk about habeas corpus, or habeas corpus. That's the right way to say it, which is one of these phrases people often hear and kind of just let bounce off their brain because it sounds old and legal and maybe a little bit intimidating. And I get that. It does sound like something you would only hear in a courtroom drama or from a stressed out history teacher right before a quiz. But the core idea is actually pretty plain. Habeas corpus is basically a court order demanding that a detained person be brought before a judge. That's the simple version. If the government is holding somebody, a court can say, all right, bring that person in and explain why you're keeping them locked up. And that second part matters the most. The government has to justify the detention. It can't just say, well, trust us. It can't just disappear somebody into a cell and expect nobody to ask questions. There has to be a reason, and a judge gets to look at that reason. You know, sometimes legal terms feel huge when they're really just describing a very human problem. Somebody has lost their freedom. Somebody is taken away from their home, their job, their family, all that kind of stuff. And the law is supposed to provide a way to ask, hold on, why is this happening? And is this lawful? That's habeas corpus. A plain language way to hear it is this. Show me the body, meaning. Show the person you're holding. Bring them into court and answer for it. I know that sounds blunt. It is blunt, but honestly, maybe it should be. Freedom is not a small thing, so the question shouldn't be soft and fuzzy. If somebody is detained lawfully, then the government should be able to say why. If it can't, or if the process was broken, or if the detention has no proper legal basis, then that's where habeas corpus becomes a shield. And I think that's why this topic still lands. Even if the phrase feels dusty, because at the bottom, it's not about fancy language. It is about a limit, a boundary. The state has power, yes, but not unlimited power. It has to answer when it takes away a person's liberty. So, if you remember nothing else from this first part, remember that. Habeas corpus means a court can demand that a detained person be brought before a judge. And the whole point is making the government explain itself. That's the heartbeat of it. Simple idea, big consequences. Now, where did this come from? Because rights like this usually don't appear out of nowhere. They usually show up because, well, people got tired of being pushed around. And that's pretty much the story here, too. Habeas corpus grew out of English common law and the long fight against arbitrary imprisonment. And when people say arbitrary imprisonment, they mean being locked up because a ruler or official decided to do it without a fair, reliable legal check. No real process, no meaningful explanation, just power being power. That struggle goes a long way back. Magna Carta is part of that long history. It is often connected to the idea that the king could not just do whatever he wanted to people, at least not without running under legal limits. Now, I don't want to overcomplicate it or pretend one document solved everything overnight, because it didn't. History is usually messier than that because Magna Carta became one of those big reference points in the argument that personal liberty matters and that rulers are not above the law. Then, over time, later legal reforms in England made personal liberty harder to ignore, bit by bit. The law built stronger ways to challenge detention. Not perfect ways, not always equal ways, but stronger ones. The basic principle kept getting sharper. If the state holds someone, there needs to be legal accountability. And then that principle crossed into American constitutional law. The United States adopted the idea that this protection was important enough to preserve, which is a pretty strong statement when you think about it. Out of all the things the Constitution can care about, this one made the list. The Constitution also puts a limit on when habeas corpus can be suspended. And that is only in extreme situations like rebellion or invasion. That wording tells you something. Suspension is not supposed to be casual, not for convenience, not because officials are irritated. It is framed as an emergency measure tied to several threats. So the American version did not invent the principle from scratch. It inherited a long legal tradition shaped by conflict over imprisonment and liberty. The old question stayed the same even when the governments changed. By what right are you holding this person? I like that continuity, honestly. Different centuries, different accents, different wigs probably, but the same basic demand. You took someone's freedom. Explain yourself. And if you can't, the courts are supposed to matter. So why does habeas corpus still matter now? In regular life, when most of us are not wandering around talking like 18th century law books, it matters because it is a check on government power, especially when someone is being held without fair process. That's the big thing. Government power can be necessary. Courts, police, detention systems, all of that exists in the real world for reasons. But any power that can take away freedom needs supervision. It needs a stop sign. Habeas corpus is one of those stop signs. It says detention is not self-justifying. The fact that the state arrests or confines someone does not automatically prove the detention is lawful. A person, through a petition, can ask the court to review whether the imprisonment is legal. That review is the safeguard. That review is the moment where somebody in authority has to answer actual questions instead of just expecting obedience. Now, in modern law, petitions can be difficult. Procedures can be narrow. Rules can be strict. Timelines, standards, paperwork, all that kind of stuff can make relief hard to get. And I think it's important to say that plainly because sometimes people hear that a right exists and assume it must be easy to use. It's not always true. But difficulty doesn't necessarily erase importance, even when the path is complicated. That basic stuff still matters as a safeguard against unlawful detention. It still represents the idea that nobody should be held by the state without some meaningful way to challenge that confinement. And I guess the way I feel about it is this is one of those protections that sounds technical until you imagine not having it. Imagine a system where the government could hold you and never really explain why to a judge. No review, no demand for justification, just silence and authority. That's not a tiny procedural issue. That's a frightening amount of unchecked power. So, yeah, habeas corpus is not just a legal term people throw around to sound smart. It's one of the oldest ways people force the state to answer for taking away freedom. That's why it lasted. That's why it keeps coming up. And that is why, even now, it deserves attention. Anyway, that's one to sit with today. Old phrase, very current question. When power locks someone up, who gets to ask why? Next time, we'll think about something else that sounds ordinary on the surface and gets a lot bigger once you look at it for a minute. That's it for this episode. I'm G, and I'm out.